Breaking the wall of human rights violations. How forensic architecture reveals war's secrets. Eyal Weizman, Goldsmiths, University of London.
Not all the walls that we break and move through are actually positive developments. Although I have to say that the wall that fell down here, or was brought down here in November of 1989, allowed me, a young Israeli, to meet my wife, who was in Leipzig at the time. However, what we see increasingly right now is that walls are being broken through by soldiers, that war enters the domestic domain, both in Palestine, in Afghanistan, in Yemen, Somalia, of course in Syria and Iraq. We see increasingly that war is urbanized. Of course, we know that most of humanity now lives in cities. Perhaps up to 70% of us are urban dwellers, and that depends on how you count it. But much more of the conflicts that take place worldwide right now are taking place in cities. And that means that the city is a place that brings civilians and military and combatants from both sides together. And the evidence is for that violence is architectural. The minute that violence happens in a city, buildings and cities become target, and architecture is potentially an evidence for human rights violation or war crime. And we could see how it enters into the heart of the domestic domain. Violence enters through walls, and it enters through ceilings into places where civilians live. So in 2010, together with a group of fellow architects, activists, artists, human rights lawyers, investigative journalists, we're quite a big group of us, we decided to form a new group and perhaps a kind of a quasi-discipline of architecture called forensic architecture. Forensic architecture, to understand it very simply, is a kind of pathology of buildings. The relationship, perhaps, between a forensic architect and an architect is that between a medical doctor and a pathologist in that sense. So, if you see here on the right-hand side an analysis of the foundation of a building, it is these kind of bits of evidence, like I showed you before, either material, as in the ruin itself, the wound on the building, or media representation of it, that we produce and provide for international prosecutors in various international forums, in international criminal tribunals, international courts, in the UN, and in other places. So we call ourselves a forensic agency, but perhaps it's going to be a bit fair to say that we are a counter-forensic agency, because forensics really is the art of the state. Forensics is the way in which the state, through its agencies, through the police, through its secret services, surveys and controls its citizens. Now, what we do is we look at the potential or alleged violence of states. We are inverting the forensic gaze. We are citizens looking at crimes of states. So if forensics 101, if the very principle of forensics is that the state should see more through its police and its technology, should know more than the criminal of a crime, this is how you could convict, we are existing and operating in a weird situation in which those alleged violators, those people exercising violence, see more, know more about the battlefield than what we could bring about. Now, there's various ways in which one can undo and invert that forensic disequilibrium, this kind of epistemic disequilibrium in knowledge on war. In that first project that I will show you, we were commissioned by the UN Special Rapporteur for Human Rights, who was presenting an investigation on American drone warfare in Pakistan to the General Assembly. And increasingly we saw that most targets of drones were actually buildings, civilian homes, But simultaneously, it was impossible for us to gather evidence because the Pakistani authorities were not allowing us to travel. There was a siege around this part of town, which was also a media siege. No image came in and out. Journalists and human rights activists were not allowed to go in. And in this situation, what we were trying to do is to use architecture in order to allow a kind of an alternative representation to emerge out of memory. Now, the problem of memory is very complicated in human rights context, because the nearer you come to the essence of a testimony, to the most painful things that somebody remembered, that is actually usually the most significant bit of the testimony, the more memory blocks out those traumas. And so people remember very well what happened before, they remember very well perhaps what happened after, but the event itself is blocked from memory. Here we interviewed a German woman who was in Pakistan at the time. She was a target to a drone strike, an American drone strike. She came back to Germany to deliver testimony, but she prefers to remain anonymous. And she was trying to recall this event, and we were helping her doing that, in fact, by building together. The need to be sound here. You'd hear her speaking in German. A process where the reconstruction of architecture and the reconstruction of memory operates and works hand in hand. Sometimes our memory is a spatial matrix of spaces, objects, and things in which we do not know in which moment in this interview process, bringing the person back into the site of the crime or into the site of the alleged crime, would actually recall the most significant testimony. And you would see here that even we were modeling with her the most minute details, the ashtrays, the stoves, the tools, beds, and all sorts of things that she was selecting and locating very, very carefully until we could, to a certain extent, try and start to reconstruct and understand what happened. I'll give you one short example. The witness was very, almost obsessed with a fan. It was a ceiling fan, she said at the beginning, on the ceiling of her house, but she started moving it around. She decided after a while that it was not a ceiling fan, it was standing on a tripod in the middle of a courtyard. And then even that she located and changed its location. We did not know why was that case until when we reconstructed the actual strike, she recalled that it was on the blades of that fan that she discovered flesh of family members of her who died within that attack. Right? So in a sense, sometimes the most minute of element is a trigger, is a pathway, an entry into memory. In another very recent investigation, we were asked to look at a secret Syrian prison, a prison that no journalists or investigators have been to, a prison where it is like a contemporary camp, in which people are starved to death, beaten to death, and there are very few survivors. Some of them came out, were refugees in Turkey. We met them, and together we were trying to reconstruct what happened there, again, from the traumatized memories of people in a situation where all senses were at their liminal state. You could hardly see anything. They were led blindfolded. They could only hear, but there was hardly any sound because they were not allowed to speak in there. And sometimes by working closely with them days and days we were building that model from the memory, but also the model itself became a mnemonic device, a conduit into further recollection by being located there. And we created also the acoustic environment of it, working really with an artist, a sound artist here, Lawrence Abu Hamdan, measuring the acoustic properties of the building, and really from sound, from vibration, we were able to reconstruct the architecture of this place. Another ways in which we work when we cannot get to places, when we can, we simply work like building surveyors, is by looking at images that come from war zones. from Waziristan in Pakistan arrived 22 seconds of a video that was broadcast by a mainstream broadcaster, in which you see nothing but a pile of rubble. But it was the first representation of a building that was destroyed by drone, and somehow from these kind of mess of rubble and ruin, we were trying to reconstruct the way the building looked, where it was in town, when this place happened. We did not even know the city it took place in, but we slowly were able to discover it. And I'll show you just an example about the way in which we work, in which we are very tuned to minute elements within the image. You see here, we started to see some fragments, shrapnel on the wall, and we started marking them very, very carefully. Each one of those points where the blast of the drone missile have actually hit the room, we were marking out as if the room itself was like a photographic film that was exposed to the blast, like a photograph is exposed to light. And slowly we started seeing an area within that wall that was emptier of shrapnel. And we started asking ourselves, why there are no shrapnel here on the right-hand side of this image? So we built a computer model of it and marked again in much more precision each one of the location. Everything in black on this image on the right is area that was not captured by the mobile phone footage that was there. We could number each one of those fragments and locate by analogy the point of the blast, which was very important later in identifying what weapon was used. This is a rendering of a photograph in real space. And we had, in fact, to build a one-to-one model of it. We did it on the occasion of the Venice Biennale, where we got actually the funding and the means to do it. We created a space out of that footage and allowed us to see that incredible shadows that you see here marked in red on the right-hand side, where there are no shrapnels, where the bodies, most likely, of the people that were killed. And here you have architecture capturing more or less the contours of a body, pathology and architecture somehow going hand in hand. And with this, we recognize the ammunition, and we showed how with this ammunition, more and more buildings and cities are being struck in Pakistan. This is a case from Gaza that we worked on a recent Israeli invasion of Gaza in 2014. We had to reconstruct it from social media. Again, Israel did not allow us to enter in there. But on social media, bits and clips do not have metadata. We don't know where and where they were taken. What we did was actually create a cloud atlas, looking at all bomb clouds and starting to compare them and to locate the very same ones, creating a kind of a panorama of the horrible meteorology of war, those clouds created by bombs that are changing. And we realized that if we could locate and time one of those clouds, we can do all others by analogy. There was a satellite, a European satellite, going overhead at precisely the same time. You see the satellite has captured a cloud. The satellite has the metadata on it. And we were looking at what we're seeing here on the right in plan, in elevation, here on the left, and when we could anchor the right time, we could start building a timeline of the event by looking simply at the meteorology, later inverting our gaze to the ground and telling the story of civilians and what was happening during that day, the 1st of August 2014, in Gaza, and what violations were taken there. That was published with Amnesty. You can look at it, but you would see, what you see here is a certain kind of cloud atlas, a kind of a trope of 19th century meteorology that become a forensic technique of understanding the relationship between images on social media. Here you would see an attack on a hospital, and you move, the model allows you to move between one image and another image, looking at the fluid dynamic of the cloud in order to navigate throughout space. I'd leave you with that last thing. The lawyers wanted to know what bomb was dropped, and we actually found one frame in this 25 frames a second that captured the bomb in mid-flight. Now, if you capture the bomb in mid-flight, you could actually locate the image in space, measure the image because you know from where to where it's going, and then measure those bombs splinter of a second before they killed 16 civilians, and understand and identify the manufacturer, the type of bomb, and bring claims with it. What I wanted to leave you with is an understanding that whether we are speaking about this or that administration, whether we are speaking about politics of parties we like or don't like, citizens and civilians need to find a way to hold government accountable. All government, when they're left to their own device, are in fact will abuse that and will revert to denial. And denial is not only about things of the past. Denial is the condition of possibility for violence to be perpetuated, because what was denied could go on being done again and again. Thank you very much.